When I drove the Haval H6 before launch, I reckoned that this would probably be about 150,000 ringgit or even more still, because underneath this bonnet lies one of the most advanced powertrains currently available on the market. So you can imagine my surprise when GWM announced that the Haval H6 HEV would only be 139,000 ringgit. So with that in mind, does that make this car better or worse? Or more importantly, is this the value buy of the year? My name is AIMAN ABDULLAH, this is Malaysian Motoring, and this is our review of the Haval H6 HEV. Now we're starting this review with a slightly strange shot because actually the real selling point of this car is what lies under the bonnet. This is a 1.5 litre turbocharged engine, which I'm sure does not seem very interesting to you at all because you can also get that in an X70 or Honda CR-V. The difference is this is mated to a 2-speed DHT or direct hybrid transmission, and then that is mated to an electric motor, which means that in addition to the decent power outputs of this car, it also produces in excess of 500 Newton meters of torque, making this the torquiest C-segment SUV out there, beating even the turbo diesel Mazda CX-5. And now we have to touch on this car's looks, which I think are a bit of a hit or a bit of a miss. See, to me, I quite like the way the Haval H6 looks because it's very inoffensive. However, to a lot of people who may be considering, say, a Cherry or an Amoda or a J-Coup, the H6 does kind of fly under the radar because it does look quite generic. So up front you get this Peugeot-like grille where it bleeds into the fenders, which I think does look quite smart, and they're flanked by full LED headlights replete with automatic LED high beam and daytime running lights with indicators. You get front fog lights down here, which are also of the LED variety, as well as very prominent Haval badging up here. It is worth noting that when you look at this car, the grille actually juts out a little bit, but the furthest edge to this car is ultimately the number plate. And so even from the side profile, to me, it does look quite good. The other thing that you may not realize about the H6 is it's actually one of the largest C-segment SUVs in its class. The wheelbase, for example, is longer than that of a CR-V, and it absolutely dwarfs a Proton X70. And as a result, driving this car around, even if you were to go past, say, a Toyota Harrier, you will feel and it will look like this is the bigger car, which I think helps a lot, particularly when you're driving out on the motorway, because, you know, road presence. And that sheer size is most obvious from here because that's when you can really tell just how wide and long this car is. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the wheelbase is of particular note because that does mean that, again, there is more space in the interior. Now, rolling stock is handled by a set of Hankook Ventus SV Evo 1 tires. I'm assuming I'm getting that overall numerical right. And they are 19-inch alloy wheels altogether. Now, one of the things I don't like about this car is the fact the alloy wheels are done up in full black. I would have appreciated if they were a dual-tone look with some diamond cut finishing on the front, for example, to provide a little bit of contrasting. However, as you move further down the side, at least those black wheels do match with this piece of black trim here, which helps to break up the monotony over the side profile. And there is at least some chrome on the bottom edge of the doors in order to, again, break up the overall metalwork. But again, there is a lot of metalwork here because this car is huge. And so not only do you have enormous rear doors, but they also open up to an enormous rear half of the cabin, which I'll touch on later. That mix of the generic and the distinctive continued to the rear, where you have a very distinctive rear LED light bar and full LED tail lights replete with LED indicators and reverse lights, although the overall design does remind me slightly of a Tiggo 8 Pro. However, you do get very distinctive third brake lights up here, which are also full LED, which at night and when you're on the brakes looks very distinctive indeed. I actually like the fact that compared to other vehicles, the LED light bar on this car is literally just one solid strip all the way across, because it means that at night it looks very different from anything else out on the road. Now, as we move below that, things start to fall apart a little bit because this very big Haval badging here is fine. It's just that on either side it gets very busy because you have GWM badging here and then you have H6 HEV badging here. There's just too many things going on. And then as you move further down, you do not get visible exhaust pipes because this is a hybrid. Instead, you get this sort of ribbed pseudo lower valence diffuser thing, which I'm pretty sure does absolutely nothing, but you do at least get a rear LED fog light here, which will be great for Vios drivers or previous gen Vios drivers who like to keep it on even in the middle of the day. Now, behind this tailgate, which is electrically powered as standard, you will find a good amount of space. As I mentioned earlier, the Haval H6 is one of the very largest vehicles in its class, which means that in terms of practicality, well, there's a lot of it. Not only can you fit a whole bunch of luggage in here, but you can also fold the rear seats flat 60-40 for even added practicality should you have longer or wider items to load in the car. The only trouble is, if you need any more space than that, you're kind of falling short, because underneath this boot floor you will find only the emergency kit for this car as well as this car's low voltage battery. That's because the high voltage battery also lives back here, and so you have no space underneath the boot floor for other things. That said, however, there are at least pockets on either side of this boot floor, which means that you can fit not one but two drinking bottles if that's important to you. There is also a 12-volt socket in here somewhere, if I can find it, as well as a little hook on the other side for you to hang up shopping bags and so on and so forth. But as far as I'm concerned, the boot of this car has been massive enough that I've just tossed in luggage and just not thought about it. Now, the inside of the Haval H6 is actually a really great place to be. Again, for a car that's going for about 140 grand, this interior really punches above its weight. So for starters, the overall cabin gets this sort of dual tone effect where you have a dark top, a lighter middle, and then a darker lower portion, which again helps to break up the monotony of the surfaces in here. There's also this lovely rose gold material, which I think does help to kind of make this cabin feel a little bit more upmarket than you might necessarily expect. Sure, it's hard plastic, but again, it just looks nice, and it's not like you're going to be touching this all the time anyway. I also like this panel here, this white material that stretches all the way across the dash, onto the doors, and then into the rear doors. In fact, wherever you touch it, it's always lovely and soft touch. And there are also lovely stitches done all the way in front of the front half of the cabin and the dash, as well as on the door cards themselves, which I think, again, make this interior look really good. That dual tone sort of design continues onto the seats, where you have a lot of this sort of white pieces breaking up the monotony of the black leatherette interior, which again looks more upmarket and feels quite nice to hold. And even though this is ultimately leatherette, it does actually feel like low quality leather, if that makes sense to you. It doesn't feel like plastic, which is more important, and they are also perforated because these two front seats are actually ventilated for your comfort. Now, beyond that, you are obviously going to notice the screens, of which there are three. I'll start with this central infotainment display. Now, we have given a lot of GWM products some grief about this, because like in the Tank, as well as the GWM Aura 07 and Aura Good Cat, this center screen is usually set quite far back, which means that in terms of ergonomics, you have to stretch out in order to make inputs. This was especially bad on the 07. But on the H6, this is a lot closer. So that means that even as I'm sat here, I can actually reach the furthest edges of the screen without having to really stretch. As you can see, my shoulder hasn't had to lift off of the seat, which is certainly very good. Now, that's good because you're going to be manipulating the screen a lot, because even though there are a bank of physical buttons here, the minute controls live in this screen. So for example, if I want to turn the air conditioning on and off, I can do that here. The front defoggers are controlled here, but if I want to adjust the temperature, that's in the screen. Same thing goes for the fan speed, and if I want to use the automatic system or the ionizer or whatever, that all lives in here. Now, this is fine because for the most part you can actually access that from this screen without too much issue. There's also a slide down from the top, which also allows you to adjust things like your wireless charger, your seat ventilation, etc., all from here. Your volume rocker also lives here, which is whatever. The problem with that is if you were to use Android Auto or Apple CarPlay, both of which are wired, and use the USB-A port down here, that display is no longer available. And in order to control the air conditioning, you actually have to cycle it on and off in order to bring up the air conditioning controls on that screen. And then you have to exit that and go back to Android Auto or Apple CarPlay, which is less than ideal. That said, however, at least, again, things like the rear defogger, your 360-degree cam, which also controls your automated parking and reverse assistant, all of those buttons live here, as well as your button for the hazards. As we move further down, there's a wireless charging pad here, a rotary gear selector for the 2-speed DHT, as well as your electronic parking brake. There is also a small cubby hole, which is nice enough to hold your phone, which is great when you have wired Android Auto, so you just run the wire up here, which is what I've been doing. There are also a set of cup holders here with a deployable sort of cup holder thing. So if you want to just use this as a cubby hole, you can do that if you want. Back here, you will find a very big center console. It is not only incredibly long, but it's also decently deep, about that deep, which means that you can actually fit quite a few things in here. Now, compared to Cherry's, this is unfortunately not air conditioned. However, because the H6 has a rear air conditioning vent which is mounted in the back, the air conditioning is actually routed around this box, and so it does actually stay pretty cool, although again there's no direct cooling. Now, because the rotary gear selector up here, it means that there is more space down here for you to hide other items. You also get a decently sized glove box as well as decently sized door bins big enough for a litre-half size bottle. Now we go back to the screens because I got distracted. Now beyond that, you get another digital instrument cluster here, which importantly has no cowling. So because there is no cover over it, you may be concerned that, glare, for example, may get in the way of you being able to read your display. There is no such issue here because the quality of the instrument cluster is as good as the instrument display, or rather this infotainment display, which means that it's not only very sharp and very bright, but also very reactive. The response time and the refresh rate on the screen is excellent, which means that you get all the information that you need the way you want it. I will also give kudos to GWM because this display is set up in just a way that you can get all the information that you need very, very easily. Now, beyond this screen, there is also a full color heads-up display, which I also have to give GWM kudos for, because not only is it very easy to read, you also get your ADAS functionalities, your navigational instructions, even if you're using Android Auto, as well as your traffic sign information system, all available right in your line of sight, which means you barely have to look at your instrument cluster altogether. This is very positive indeed, which means that as you're sat here, life is pretty good. Now I want to talk about the steering wheel, because although this is very adjustable, as you can see, which means that it's very easy to get into a comfortable driving position, the controls on this screen, on this steering wheel, are not exactly how you'd expect. So you have a bunch of physical controls on the steering wheel itself, which is all very easy to use. They're quite tactile, and because everything is on a slightly different level from each other, it's very easy for your thumbs to find the button that you're looking for when you're driving along. However, even though there is a lot of space here, they've still somehow seen fit to put the cruise control on a separate stalk down here. Now, my problem with that is because of how it's set, as you're sat here, you can't actually see this stalk at all. However, if you've driven this car for more than 20 minutes, you will realize just how this stalk works. And then once you do, as I've discovered over the last 1100 kilometers I've driven this car, you don't look for it at all. Instead, as you're driving along with your eyes set directly in front of you, you just reach for this and you know exactly what you're manipulating. I love this, and I think the overall implication and execution of it is excellent. Now, in terms of driving position, as you saw, this is quite adjustable. The two front seats are also electrically adjustable with a Boss switch for this front passenger seat should you want to make further adjustments. However, like many Chinese cars, even though this car does offer lumbar support, it does not offer tilt adjustment, where you adjust the angle of the seat rest rather than just the height altogether, which means that for me, I've had to sit a little bit further back and actually stretch my leg all the way into the firewall in order to enjoy some degree of under-thigh support. I also do not appreciate that even though I am not the tallest person in the world, these front seats are not as long as I'd like them to be, which has led to some degree of discomfort sort of around my hip area when I've driven this car for more than 3 hours at a time. Now, as I've mentioned multiple times now, the Haval H6 has the longest wheelbase in its class, which means that with the front seat set at my driving position, about 170 centimeters, you can see I have acres of knee room and a pretty good amount of headroom despite the standard fit panoramic sunroof with an electronic sunblind, which means that life in the back is pretty good. I also get a couple of USB ports here, both USB-A unfortunately, as well as those air conditioning vents I mentioned earlier. The door bins are actually large enough to keep the majority of the items that you need, but it is worth noting that you can't really fit a bottle in here unless you try to squeeze it in. I've got pockets behind the rear seats, which is always nice to see. There's also a random piece of paper in here. I've got pockets in the doors, which is always nice. This floor is relatively flat, which means that even if you are sat in the middle, because it's wide enough, there is plenty of space not only for your arse, but also for your feet, which means that 3 abreast back here is surprisingly more comfortable than you might expect from within the C segment. These rear seats can also be folded flat, as I mentioned earlier, but there is no tilt adjustment, but you do get a deployable center armrest with cup holders, and sat here like this, life is pretty comfortable indeed. Now, having that long wheelbase doesn't just benefit rear adult occupants in terms of knee room. It also means that if you have child seats back here, it shouldn't be too much of an issue. Again, I'm about 170 centimeters. With the front seat set up the way I usually sit, you can actually fit a bulky rear-facing child seat in here without too much issue at all. There are ISOFIX mounts on the outer seats only, not the one in the middle nor on the front seat, which means that these are the only seats where you can mount a child seat. And of course, if you do have a child sat back here, you'll appreciate the fact the window line on this car is not ridiculously high, although touching this panel does reveal that the top half is scratchy, where on the top half of the front half of the cabin, on the doors in the front at least, they are nice and soft touch. But at least everything here is soft and here is soft, so it isn't really all that bad. Now again, the Haval H6 has thus far been a very pleasant surprise, particularly again, given the fact that this is a 140,000 ringgit C-segment SUV competing with the likes of the Honda CR-V, the Proton X70, as well as the Mazda CX-5. However, the surprises continue from behind the wheel. Because the Haval H6 is... let me explain. So the thing about this car is that obviously the main point here is that powertrain. So you've got that 1.5 litre turbocharged engine paired to the 2-speed automatic gearbox, as well as the hybrid drive system. Now, the total system output on this car is quite heady, and that may lead you to believe that this shouldn't behave that way, because how can a 1.5 litre turbocharged engine feel like this? Well, it does that because of the hybrid system. Now, GWM is very proud of the fact that this powertrain is something they developed in-house, and so this transmission, the engine, the hybrid drive, etc., this is all a GWM proprietary system. So to them, they feel that they've been able to optimize this perfectly for applications within their cars. And so within the first few minutes of driving the Haval H6, it becomes very obvious that this is a very well-polished powertrain. If you've driven a hybrid system from, say, Toyota or Honda, you will have that same sense of polish in terms of its execution, which is nice to see given the fact that GWM and Haval are ultimately relatively new entrants into our market. Now, I have to get a little bit nerdy about this system because it is worth pointing out just how it works. So if you're familiar with Honda's hybrid system, then you will be broadly familiar with the way this system works, in the sense that the engine works primarily as a generator, generating power to feed into the battery, which then feeds into the electric motor mounted over the front axle. Now, that means that 90% of the time when you drive about, like as I am now, doing, suburban speeds, going about your usual business, etc., this is just an electric drive, mostly an electric drive. So your motive force comes exclusively from the electric motor, resulting in very, very smooth power delivery. And it means that you get a lot less vibrations from the powertrain because, again, it's mostly being driven by the electric motor. It's only when you ask for a little bit more of the system does the internal combustion engine actually kick in. So the internal combustion engine will turn on and off when it sees fit, based on whatever conditions it might be in. But more importantly, when you are at full throttle, then the engine and the electric motor work together in order to provide maximum motive force. This is where that 2-speed hybrid transmission comes in, because the 2 gears that it has are geared towards higher speed driving, which is where the engine is most efficient. But even then, it still works together with the electric motor in order to provide that performance. So that's why this car is able to offer over 500 Newton meters of torque, which is a very heady number given the fact this is ultimately a family SUV. This is a sort of car that people buy to drive their kids to school in and go to work and do, the normal daily grind. It's nothing particularly more special than that. And so to me, it's quite impressive they're able to offer this level of performance, again, in a vehicle like this. It would have been a lot cheaper for them, for example, to offer the H6 solely as a 1.5 litre turbo, but instead they've offered it exclusively as a hybrid. Now, what that means is when you're driving along like this, as I mentioned earlier, it's mostly electric drive, but then when you put your foot down, the internal combustion motor brake wakes up, and although the initial torque is provided by the electric motor, it's then very quickly supplied and enforced further by that turbocharged engine, which again just creates this very efficient and very smooth powertrain altogether. Now, in the preview drive, I mentioned, emphasized, underscored, underlined many times that this powertrain is very smooth. However, because I've had a bit more time with this car, I can actually reveal that it's not as smooth as I initially expected. This is because during the handover between electric and combustion motivation to the front wheels, as I think it begins to engage and disengage the gearbox, I think, there is a little bit of sort of shell shock. There's a little bit of like a juddering motion, but it only happens once. It's sort of like a gunk, like that, and that's it. It's very minor, but it is noticeable, which means that I have to sell this to you again, because in case you test drive one of these going, AIMAN said it was super smooth. Yeah, okay, there is just a little bit of a lack of smoothness, just a little bit, okay, just a little bit. But aside from that, the rest of the experience in this car is very smooth, buttery smooth in fact. This car hands over power from the electric motor to the internal combustion and back again, otherwise very smoothly indeed. And in fact, when you're driving along, you can actually get a little display on your instrument cluster, which I have up, in order to show me if it's either in parallel drive, BEV drive, or tandem drive. Parallel and tandem drive are actually two different modes. Parallel is when the electric motor, or rather the internal combustion engine, is charging the battery, and then that powers the motor. Tandem is when both powertrains are working together to provide motive force, or vice versa. I spoke to GWM several times and even they can't give me a straight answer, but one of those things mean one of those things. But ultimately, the complication of this powertrain doesn't really matter, because the bottom line is, what is it like to drive? So the power delivery in this car, as I mentioned, is very smooth, and because you have all that torque, it does mean that when you're getting, say when you're merging into a motorway or you're trying to overtake, that torque is delivered instantaneously without any hesitation whatsoever, which means that this Haval H6 actually feels a lot more powerful than you might initially expect. And then, when you are driving along, say you hit your comfortable cruise speed, about 110, 120 kilometers an hour, that's when you really reap the benefits of this complicated powertrain. Because I've driven this car from KL to Penang and back with a little few errands to run on the island as well as in KL before I left and when I got there. And the total average consumption on this car, as it stands today, having covered 1,081 kilometers, is 7.2 liters to the 100. Now again, bear in mind, this is a car that is not only incredibly powerful, but also incredibly comfortable. And so to be able to provide numbers like that, that's the sort of fuel economy figure that I used to only get from a diesel vehicle. My company car is a BMW 320d, and I only get numbers like that when the roads are absolutely clear. I can only get numbers like that from, say, a diesel Mazda CX-5, again when the roads are absolutely clear. I'd like to point out that when I drove to and from Penang, there were traffic jams, terrible ones. We're talking about 45-50 minutes of stop-start traffic, and I'm still getting numbers like these. And when I was driving about in town, both in KL and in Penang, the average fuel consumption was about 6.2 to 6.6 liters to the 100, which again is also very impressive given the performance on offer, and the fact that this is also an enormous C-segment SUV. It only gets better, in fact, when you start using this car's active safety features. So the Haval H6 comes as standard with level 2 semi-autonomy systems, which include autonomous emergency braking with pedestrian and cyclist detection, lane keep assist, lane centering assist, blind spot monitoring, a fantastic 360-degree camera, as well as the reverse assist that I mentioned earlier, as well as automated parking. All of these things are the sort of stuff that you'd expect from a car that's sort of competing within the C segment nowadays. And so this is generally par for the course. It's nothing to write home about. What I find particularly impressive is the way it goes about its business. So the Haval H6 utilizes a camera and radar system in order to read the world around it. Now, when you have the system engaged, you get a display not only in your instrument cluster but also your heads-up display, so you can tell what it can see and what it perceives. In terms of the lane centering assist, in this car it is not so aggressive that it is irritating. In fact, I had the lane centering assist on the entire time I drove from KL to Penang, and I didn't even realize it was on. Not because it wasn't doing anything, but because what it was doing was so subtle that I just thought, what an easy car to drive. That's great. And even when you drive about in town, it's not so aggressive that it actually gets in the way of you trying to, say, cut out of your lane slightly to avoid a motorcycle, for example, which was particularly useful when I was driving up and down Tanjung Bunga, but that is beside the point. However, in terms of the traffic jam assist and radar guided cruise control, while both of those systems work fantastically, and I really do mean fantastically, this is miles better than what you get from a Cherry or even a Proton for that matter, it is unfortunate that the follow distance is a little bit too far. It is unnaturally far, which means that for me, I usually just switch it off unless I'm in a traffic jam. Now, the other downside to using the radar-guided cruise control actually comes in terms of the powertrain itself. So like many hybrids and electric vehicles, when you drive this car along, one pedal or not, when you come off the throttle, the car will naturally use that momentum in order to regenerate power for the battery. Now, this is especially useful when you're in one pedal mode because it means that you barely have to use the brake pedal at all. The only trouble is when you're using the radar-guided cruise control, it doesn't seem to recuperate any power. Now, I noticed this when I was driving again on the motorway going to and from Penang, which meant that when I was going there, I was generating almost no power whatsoever. But when I came back, having realized that, I got into the habit of disengaging the cruise control in order to slow down manually in order to recuperate as much energy as possible. I did this in order to try and maximize the range and reduce the fuel economy to better understand just what this car is capable of doing based on how you drive it. And overall, I do still think that, that's something you can do, or if you don't want to, you don't have to, because the car will generate enough power as it needs or as it sees fit. But even then, even if you choose not to do that, I really think that this Haval H6 is pretty much unflappable. If you ask me, yes, this H6 is not the best car to drive. In terms of driving dynamics, the primary ride is excellent. It isolates you from the world around you, but the secondary ride is not so great because you do feel a little bit of body roll. Also, the tires are not so great. These Hankook Ventus tires are less than ideal. I'd probably put Continentals on this in order to reduce the amount of road noise that it kicks up, because wind noise in this car is surprisingly well suppressed, even though there is no acoustic glass on the side windows, only the windscreen. So change the tires and don't drive it like a buck. Do those things and the H6 becomes an excellent vehicle. I think this is the sort of car that 90% of people would be very, very happy to drive around in every day. It's comfortable, it's quiet, it's incredibly efficient, and the warranty on this is also excellent. On top of that, because the electric battery in this car is not that big, it's less than 2 kilowatt hours, it does mean that when the battery does eventually deplete, it's not going to cost all that much in order to replace. And the longevity of these batteries are pretty much guaranteed because the internal combustion engine is always there in order to keep the electric battery at a state of charge where it can maximize longevity. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm not concerned about durability in the Haval H6. I'm not concerned about long-term usability. I think this is an excellent car that a lot of people would be happy to live with. However, if you like the fuel economy offered by this car, but you want a little bit more dynamic ability, then you may be better served by the Mazda CX-5 diesel. Because being a turbo diesel, it is naturally very efficient, but at least you don't have the hybrid complication if you're the kind of person who's afraid of that sort of thing. And of course, if you want a hybrid vehicle that is even more comfortable and even more isolating to drive, then you may be better served by the Toyota Corolla Cross Hybrid, because although that car is about to be updated actually at time of filming, it will at least be a little bit more costing, a little bit more isolating, which means that when you are in the car, especially when you're doing traffic jam stints and stuff like that, you do feel a little bit more serene. But put together, I do think that this Haval H6 is an excellent package, and it's certainly something for you to consider if you're shopping within the segment, especially at that 140,000 ringgit price tag. In any case, that concludes our review of the GWM Haval H6 HEV. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to be notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We will catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.